In this video, rather than review a Bible, I'll compare two translations, the New King James Version and the English Standard Version. Here's the outline. I want to move quickly, so you may wish to pause the video from time to time. We'll begin with a few words by way of background. The New King James Version is a revision of the King James Version. It has replaced archaic language with present-day vocabulary, punctuation, and grammar. The translators called their translation philosophy complete equivalence. They sought to preserve all the information in the text while presenting it in good literary form. The Old Testament source text is the 1967-77 Biblia Hebraica Stuttgartensia, though the influence of ancient versions is sometimes detectable. The New Testament is based on the Textus Receptus, but no particular edition is identified. I assume they use Scribner's 19th century edition. The English Standard Version is a revision of the Revised Standard Version of 1971. The translators call the ESV an essentially literal translation. The ESV Old Testament is based on the Hebrew Masoretic text, but it also follows ancient versions sometimes. The English Standard Version translators also made use of the Dead Sea Scrolls. I'll show a chart later that tries to gauge how often various translations stray from the Masoretic Hebrew. The English Standard Version New Testament is based on the Nestle Aland 28th edition, but as we'll see later, the translators didn't feel bound to follow it by any means. The NKJV and the ESV are both direct descendants of the KJV, but the ESV is several generations removed. The NKJV New Testament dates to 1979, and as far as I know it was last updated in 1984. The ESV is more recent, first published in 2001, and undergoing minor revisions in 2007, 2011, and 2016. You can often detect the shared ancestry of two translations by comparing them side by side in a passage. Here they are in the first three verses of the 23rd Psalm, with the 2011 NIV in the right-hand column for contrast. Both the NKJV and the ESV have shall not want, which goes back to the KJV. The NIV has lack nothing. Similarly, still waters goes back to the KJV. The NIV has quiet waters. They both have restores my soul, a modernization of the KJV's restoreth my soul. The NIV chose refreshes instead of restores. Both NKJV and ESV sound like the KJV in the phrases highlighted in green. The NIV has along the right paths there. Their similarities are often due to this shared ancestry, both being in the Tyndale tradition. But unlike the KJV, they both emphasize Christ's deity in Titus 2:3 and 2 Peter 1:1. They both have faith in Christ rather than faith of Christ or the faithfulness of Christ in passages like Galatians 3:22. Unlike several modern translations, neither the NKJV nor the ESV employs contractions, as far as I've been able to tell. Both sometimes use shall rather than replacing it entirely with will, as some modern translations do. Both, of course, use modern verb endings and modern pronouns. Both have virgin rather than young woman in Isaiah 7:14. There are some significant differences between the two translations. The NKJV marks words translators supply to smooth the English, words that don't correspond directly to anything in the source languages, with an italic font. The NKJV capitalizes pronouns that refer to deity, the ESV does not. The NKJV translates what are called substantival participles in the old way, with he who expressions, while the ESV tends to use the one who or whoever expressions. For instance, the NKJV has "He who believes and is baptized will be saved" in Mark 16:16, but the ESV reads, "Whoever believes and is baptized will be saved." The NKJV uses the term brethren, but the ESV is more likely to read brothers, and to include a footnote that explains that the word translated brothers may mean brothers and sisters. The NKJV often retains the word man, where the ESV replaces that with person, self, or being. Romans 5:7 and Romans 7:22 are good examples. While both translations provide footnotes that identify variant readings, those in the ESV concentrate on variations within the older manuscripts. The NKJV's footnotes attempt to inform the reader where the Textus Receptus, the NKJV's Greek source text, differs from one modern critical edition and from one edition of the Byzantine text, that is, the text preserved in the later Roman Empire. I realize that this is a petty point, but it annoys me that the ESV uses spit as the past tense of spit. Continuing with differences, the NKJV retains the pleonastic expression answered and said. The ESV is more likely than the NKJV to translate the Greek imperfect tense using an English past continuous tense verb or a began to expression. That has become a common characteristic in modern English translations. I show a couple of examples here. The ESV translates a certain Hebrew word as steadfast love, while the NKJV, in agreement with the KJV, uses mercy. When you read the Old Testament prophets in the King James Version, you often run across the expression, the burden of. The New King James Version turns that into the burden against, but it retains the word burden. The ESV prefers the word oracle. The NKJV often uses which rather than that in restrictive clauses, which serves to give it something of an antique flavor. Modern style guides tend to favor the use of that in such clauses, though perhaps that's only true in the United States. I wish I had comprehensive data on the popularity of various translations among Christian denominations, but I don't. I'd also like to know how the popularity of translations varies with the age of the reader, but I don't have that kind of information either. As a poor substitute, I offer here a chart that lists the names of well-known teachers and authors who use each. Although both translations are widely used, I was impressed with the diversity of the denominational backgrounds of NKJV users. Perhaps that's due to the enduring popularity of the KJV and the desire of pastors and teachers to use a translation that people who still carry the KJV to church can easily follow. All of that was background. We'll now move to our first major subject, readability. Let me begin by asserting that a more readable translation isn't necessarily a better one. I give my reasons for saying that here. Remember that you can pause the video at any time. On this chart, I compiled the reading level scores from various internet sources for 4 translations. Of course, we're interested in the NKJV and ESV, the 2 columns toward the left. These sources tend to imply that the ESV is harder to read than the NKJV, which contradicts my personal experience with the 2 translations. I don't know how to score reading levels, so I'm not going to contest the actual grade levels on the chart. But in what follows, I hope to convince you that the NKJV is harder to read than the ESV, not easier, as Bible Gateway and Christian book distributors imply. The sources highlighted in green seem to me to have the right of it. Again, I don't know if the grade levels are correct, but Mardell, A.P. Brown, and LFJ have the NKJV at a higher grade level than the ESV, and that makes sense to me. I skimmed through Ecclesiastes and Hebrews in the 2 translations, comparing the vocabulary and the forms of expression used. In the next few charts, I placed a star beside what I think is the more difficult wording. Vexation is more difficult than grief, but in every other instance on this chart, the NKJV seems more difficult. Certainly countenance is harder than face. Another set of examples here. Putrefy is clearly harder than give off a stench. While the ESV picks up points for difficulty with Sheol, sloth, and indolence, most of the stars are in the NKJV column. On this chart, we move deeper into the book of Hebrews, and the situation remains as before. Tabernacle is plainly more difficult than tent, and tarry than delay. Still more examples here. And here. Covetousness has to be harder than love of money to comprehend. So overall, based on a survey of those two books, it's difficult to see how the ESV could be regarded as employing a more challenging vocabulary. Now let's compare some passages side by side. Let's start with 1 Corinthians 4, verses 12 through 13. The NKJV's being reviled seems a bit harder to understand than when reviled. The NKJV's defamed strikes me as a harder word than slandered. Both use entreat, but the NKJV gives a synonym and a footnote. I don't see any real difference in difficulty between filth and scum. Please excuse the pun on the chart. Although both offscouring and refuse are a bit uncommon, I think offscouring is a little less usual. All points considered, I would say that the NKJV is harder to comprehend in this passage. We move forward 4 chapters in the same book to 1 Corinthians 8, verses 7 through 8. There is not in everyone that knowledge is more literal than not all possess this knowledge, but it's also more oblique. The NKJV has consciousness, where the ESV has association, because they're translating different Greek texts. As a result, the ESV reads more smoothly. I think the ESV's eat food is easier to understand than eat it. In verse 8, the ESV drops the opening but and breaks the verse into shorter sentences. We are no worse off if we do not eat, and no better off if we do, reads more smoothly than the NKJV's translation, in my opinion. My verdict here again is that the NKJV is more difficult to read. We'll skip forward to 2 Corinthians. This is chapter 11, verse 12. There's no doubt in my mind that the ESV is easier to follow here. A key factor in the ESV's clarity is the fact that it translates a noun, starting point, opportunity, pretext, as an infinitive, to claim. That choice allows the ESV to rework the NKJV's more literal an opportunity to be regarded, beginning in there in the 3rd line down on the left, into to claim that they work. Similarly, in their boasted mission is less wordy and roundabout than the more literal in the things of which they boast. Finally, these changes required the more literal just as we are to be reworked into on the same terms as we do. Here's an example from Galatians. We're in chapter 4, verses 17 through 18. The ESV's to make much of is inherently easier to understand than the NKJV's zealously court. I regard the ESV as easier to read in this passage. Next, take a look at John chapter 20, verse 23. The NKJV reads, "If you retain the sins of any." But it isn't immediately clear how one person can retain another's sins, so it requires some reflection to understand the NKJV's meaning. By contrast, the ESV's withhold forgiveness from any is straightforward. 1 Corinthians 1, 4 through 7. The NKJV's utterance is more difficult than the ESV's speech. Verse 6 in the NKJV raises questions. Is the testimony of Christ the testimony he provides, or the testimony about him? Does in you mean inside you? The ESV is less puzzling. The NKJV's come short is somewhat less clear than the ESV's to be lacking. All in all, the ESV is easier to understand. As a final example on the subject of readability, consider Philippians 1, 6 through 7. The NKJV's, being confident of this, is less straightforward than the ESV's, I am sure of this. But I think the ESV's bring it to completion is harder than the NKJV's will complete it. The ESV breaks the passage into shorter sentences. The NKJV's in my chains is arguably more literal than the ESV's in my imprisonment, but the latter is less likely to cause confusion. On balance, the ESV seems easier to comprehend here. All these examples confirm my subjective impression that the ESV is easier to read. In the next section, we'll examine the literalness of the translations. In my view, a more literal translation is not necessarily a better translation. Personally, I prefer a literal translation for private study, but highly literal translations may not be appropriate for private devotional use or for public reading. Literalness, which represents the word-for-word character of the translation, should also be distinguished from accuracy. Accuracy describes the degree to which the author's meaning is conveyed into the target language, in our case English. For instance, a literal translation of a flawed source text would be inaccurate to the degree that errors in the source are reflected in the translation. The way I measure literalness, the NKJV is the more literal of the two translations. Part of that is due to the fact that the NKJV uses italic type to identify translator-supplied smoothing words. Both are much more literal than the NIV, the Revised English Bible, or the Jerusalem Bible. We'll quickly compare the two translations with a view to literalness in a few passages, beginning in 1 Thessalonians 4:4. Here, the NKJV's how to possess his own vessel is more literal than the ESV's interpretive how to control his own body. The ESV's footnote agrees that the NKJV is the more literal translation here. It's interesting to observe how these translations depend on their parents. The NKJV simply modernized the KJV in this passage, though it replaced fornication with sexual immorality. The ESV moved the RSV's translation into a footnote, and the RSV's footnote into the text. We'll move next to Romans 2:4. The ESV is more literal than NKJV early in the verse, where the NKJV fails to translate a conjunction. But toward the end, the ESV, following the RSV, inserts an expression that is absent from the Greek, is meant to. In this case, accuracy is impacted, since to lead and to intend to lead are very different concepts. 1 Peter 1:13, where we find the expression, gird up the loins of your mind. As the ESV footnote agrees, the NKJV is more literal here. Curiously, the ESV is also less literal than its parent, the RSV, which reads, therefore, gird up your minds. By removing this colorful expression to the footnote, the ESV improved readability. Many prefer that approach. For my part, I would rather see girding up the loins of your mind in the text and preparing your minds for action as an explanation in the footnote. Next, let's take a look at Romans 11:14, where we see a contest between my flesh and my fellow Jews. The Greek that the ESV translates as my fellow Jews is mutin sarka, my flesh. The ESV also inserts thus, which corresponds to nothing in the Greek. The 1971 Revised Standard Version reads, in order to make my fellow Jews jealous and thus save some of them. So the ESV is rather close to the RSV here. Personally, I would prefer to see my flesh in the text and my fellow Jews in a footnote. But it seems plain that the approach the RSV and ESV have taken produces a verse that's easier to read. 1 Corinthians 1:29 is similar, where the choice is between the NKJV's flesh and the ESV's human being. Unlike the previous example, the ESV here provides the literal reading in a footnote. The footnote makes it clear that the NKJV is more literal. By the way, the difference at the end of the verse is textual. The Textus Receptus, or TR, reads, His presence. NA28 reads, The presence of God. Another example, like these last two, can be found in Romans 6:19, where the ESV reads, Your natural limitations. The NKJV provides the more literal translation, the weakness of your flesh. We'll next examine Romans 10:10. The Greek has is dikaiosounein and is soterion here. The NKJV renders these Greek phrases literally. The ESV, following the RSV, turns these prepositional phrases into present passive tense verbs. I have heard Restoration Movement preachers argue that the ESV gives a false impression here. They prefer the more literal translation on the left because they interpret unto to mean something like up to the edge of. Thus, in their view, belief and confession only bring one near justification and salvation. By the way, just to ensure you know what I'm talking about, the Restoration Movement is represented in the United States by three groups: the Disciples of Christ, the Christian churches, and the Churches of Christ. That last group tends to avoid the use of instrumental music in worship. Romans 7:2 presents us with a few details to examine. The ESV inserts the word her twice in the verse, though there is no corresponding pronoun in the Greek. In addition, the ESV transforms the literal law concerning the husband into the more interpretive the law of marriage. On balance, the ESV is more literal than its parent, the RSV, but there are exceptions, and this is one of them. The RSV ends the verse with the law concerning the husband, which the ESV's footnote agrees is more literal. 2 Corinthians 4:1. The NKJV has, as we have received mercy, while the ESV reads, by the mercy of God. As the ESV's footnote indicates, the NKJV's as we have received mercy is more literal. A more literal translation of kathos iliethemion than the ESV's rendering by the mercy of God. The RSV also reads by the mercy of God. In my opinion, the ESV is easier to understand. In Galatians 3:14, the NKJV has the promise of the Spirit, while the ESV reads the promised Spirit. As the ESV's footnote indicates, the NKJV is more literal. By replacing the promise of the Spirit with an explanation, the ESV makes it less likely the reader will puzzle over the verse and explore other possible meanings. Here the ESV is less literal than the RSV, which reads the promise of the Spirit. Ephesians 4:22-24 brings up a topic we mentioned briefly earlier. Where the NKJV has man, the ESV reads self. As the ESV's footnote points out, the NKJV's man is more literal than the ESV's self. Note also that in verse 23, the Greek word translated as mind is singular, as in the New King James Version. Take a look at Colossians 3:5. As the ESV's footnote points out, the NKJV's your members, which are on the earth, is more literal than what is earthly in you, which the ESV carried over from the Revised Standard Version. As an aside, the word your in the first line on the left is in the Textus Receptus, but it's absent from the Nestle-Aland 28th edition. In 2 Thessalonians 3:12, The ESV once again inserts an explanation into the text. As the ESV's footnote points out, eat their own bread is more literal than earn their own living, which the ESV carried over from the RSV. Notice also that the word persons, shown in purple in the first line on the right, is absent from the Greek. I would prefer it had the ESV placed eat their own bread in the text and earn their own living as an explanation in a footnote. 1 Peter 4:18 provides another example of the ESV replacing an unclear literal expression with an explanation. As the ESV's footnote points out, the NKJV's "where will the ungodly and sinner appear" is more literal than "what will become of the ungodly and the sinner" presented in the ESV. Incidentally, the RSV is also more literal than the ESV here. The RSV reads, "Where will the impious and sinner appear?" Perhaps the ESV adjusted that rendering because translators considered it too obscure. We move next to Revelation 11:8, where the contest is between the NKJV's spiritually and the ESV's symbolically. As the ESV's footnote points out, spiritually is more literal than symbolically. The ESV is similar to the RSV, which reads allegorically. In this example, taken from Ephesians 1:9 through 10, the ESV reverses the order of Him and Christ. In both the Nestle-Aland 28th edition, the text the ESV translates, and the Textus Receptus, which the NKJV translates, the word Christ appears in verse 10, the way it does in the NKJV. The Revised Standard Version reversed the order of Christ and Him, presumably to improve readability, and the ESV simply adopted the RSV's choice. 1 Corinthians 11:10 shows the importance of italic font. Because it doesn't use a special font for translator-supplied smoothing words, the ESV gives the reader the false impression that a symbol of is in the text. The same is true for the word her in her head. It's implied by the Greek, but not actually present there. And here we will close the first part of our comparison of the NKJV with the ESV. The next part will begin with a discussion of the source text.